Hi everyone, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and I hope that you're doing well. I'd like to share a few thoughts about a mystery that I read. It was strange and fascinating, it was exquisitely written, and it was one of those existential mysteries, the philosophical type, where the search for a missing person or the truth about a death long ago is doubling as the detectives search for some truth about his or her own identity, some truth that's greater about the universe, a spiritual quest. And these can be extraordinary when they're well written. Antonio Tabucci in For Isabel, a Mandala has produced one of the best that I've read in recent years. It is extremely well written, and it is fascinating. We have a character who has returned to Portugal in the aftermath of the Salazar regime to look for Isabel. She's a woman who is remembered from high school, who is remembered from college, and then she disappears. She was imprisoned, and it's believed that she died there under horrifying circumstances. But as this character continues to search for the truth, we realize there's a lot more going on. The man who's lost his way needs to symbolize the universe with an integrative art form. In short, he needs his cardinal points, and that's why I'm here. A person can't believe it's possible to reach the boundaries of the universe because the universe has no boundaries. She stopped and smiled her tired smile. And what about you, she asked. Why are you here? I'm trying to reach a center, I answered. I've passed through many concentric circles and I'm looking for a clue. That's why I came here. You believe in concentric circles, Lisa asked. I don't know, I said. It's a practice like any other. Maybe it's an integrative art form too. But I'm not a follower. Then what are you, she asked. Just think of me as someone who searches, I answered. And the search is the heart of this book. This character is in moving through a mandala of concentric circles. And it's interesting in how Tabucci uses that structure of art or of spirituality to parallel the mystery. The idea that, yes, as we move through a mystery, we are sinking closer and closer and closer to some truth. Each layer is bringing us to a new point, a new understanding, a new perspective of what actually happened. Whether we ultimately reach that center or not is this fascinating question that's sort of left open, both in life and in great books. And so Tabucci allows us to have this detective moving through these circles. We remember Isabel at different points. I was majoring in classics, a choice which in the ideological division that existed then at the University of Lisbon was considered conservative. And it's true, the classics students didn't do anything. They never called any meetings. They never even went to the cafeteria, where most real discussions took place. Isabel majored in modern languages, and that major, yes, that one had some life to it. One professor taught a course on Camus and existentialism, another a course on surrealism in Portugal, and there were even poets from that illustrious movement who came and read their work. I can't remember who anymore, but they were well known, and it was a real triumph. The assembly hall was packed. I would remember Isabel, who had become a leader and introduced the poets to the students. There were even kids sitting on the floor. Not that those poets spoke out directly against fascism. This just wasn't possible. But their poems were nonconformist, in some ways. Revolutionary. Revolutionary in quotes, though, because back then everything was in quotes. Isabel stepped onto the stage in her pink scarf, and this too was a sign. Back then you couldn't use red. You had to use a color tied to red. And that was a sign. It felt strange seeing Isabel again up on the stage in that assembly hall. She spoke with ease, maybe even a slight nervous inflection to her voice. And so we get these little memories, these kernels that allow us to see new perspectives on Isabel's life, new perspectives on the world of Portugal under the Salazar regime. What was life like? What was life like as a student at that time? But each chapter serves as a new layer, and essentially it's a new interview between our narrator, this first-person narrator, Sophocles, and some new person who can tell a little bit more about what happened to Isabel. A guard who perhaps knew her in prison, someone who knew her in school, someone who, a priest who perhaps had an association with her. Did she ever escape from prison? Was there someone whose identity she took in order to escape? And who was that person? Who were the other individuals who knew the person with the stolen identity? And so each of these pieces is quite fascinating, and the fragments they reveal. We're interviewing a prison guard at this point. What about you, I argued. Haven't you been an official your entire life as well? Yes, he murmured, but consider in what capacity. You know, dear sir, at times the prisoners arrived beaten to a pulp because the Pied had scooped them up and they meant business. After the infirmary, prisoners went into the cells with their faces bruised, their lungs swollen from the beatings. And then I, Uncle Tom, looked after them, made them coffee, iced their injuries, and they confided in me, gave me letters for their families that I mailed at the main post office, things like that. I helped them. I did everything I could because I knew what my brothers in Cape Verde were suffering to be free. They were suffering the exact same things. And then one evening, Miss Isabel arrived. And so we see each of these little individuals. How did their lives intersect with Isabel? And what's fascinating is that none of them know the narrator. None of them remember the narrator. And so as this narrator detective is moving through these circles, it continues to be this just absolutely fascinating journey where he's constantly almost like peeping into this window that he has an association with but wasn't there for. And it creates this voyeuristic quality, both as a reader, but because it's in the first person, like through the reader, like we're part of that narrator's sort of voyeurism. And it's really an experience to read this book. But the philosophy continues to push forward in interesting ways. We have a character who replies, I have to tell you, nature may have been cruel to them, but these people, just like us, know what it means to be happy or unhappy, to feel sadness, regret, joy, everything we feel. We proud, miserable beings who think of ourselves as normal. She finished her champagne, we started eating, and she went on, I don't know why I'm telling you all this. I don't even remember your name. Slovakia, I repeated. My name's Slovakia. All right, Mr. Slovakia, Lisa said. One day, life stole my boy from me, because life's not just cruel, it's evil. She stared again into empty space, as if no one was sitting across from her. What would you have done? She asked. I don't know, I answered. It's really hard to answer a question like that. What did you do? Lisa let out a small sigh. I asked myself why, here on planet Earth. Why was there a life fashioned in such a way that I didn't understand? I'm not sure I'm making myself clear. It all seemed like a puppet theater. I spent my nights at the observatory, but those telescopes weren't enough for me anymore. I needed to observe vast interstellar spaces. I was here on Earth. I was a minuscule dot that wanted to study the boundaries of the universe. That's what I wanted. It was the only thing that might give me a little peace. And you, what would you have done in my place? I don't know, I answered. And so that final sort of confrontation, the final witness who can bear evidence to the truth about Isabel, but also the truth about life, provides perhaps the most heartrending story in a whole sequence of tales that have involved seeing the horrors of fascism, the horrors of a repressive regime. And yet here it becomes so personal, about a mother talking about her child. And so it's extraordinary what Tabucchi accomplishes across this book. Now, there is a twist about the narrator detective, and I don't want to spoil it, but there is a twist. It's so subtle. It's mentioned at the very beginning and at the very end, but it's so subtle that you may miss it if you're not reading closely. So if you do end up reading this and enjoying it, please let me know, and let me know if you got the twist. It's a really wonderful book to read. And as I said, it's one of those books where it asks just as many questions as it leaves answered or unanswered. So this is a great one. Thinking about other works, of course, I was thinking about Ricardo Romero's The President's Room, a book that was set in Argentina and about a repressive regime there, and about how a child and his family deal with that and how they experience it and contextualize it within their own house. So it was very personal in the same way that For Isabel was, and yet it had a very different setting and very different tone in many ways, but this felt very close. The spiritual quest side really reminded me of Attar. There are elements of the book that it's subtitled A Mandala. There are elements of the book that openly refer to not just existentialism and Camus, but to Indian spirituality, Indian religion. And so there were elements, though, that I found were connected to the ideas Attar was producing in the Conference of the Birds, a work from Iran. But a work nonetheless that is about sort of this quest and this long journey for a greater truth. Another one would be A King Alone by Giono. There's an epigraph from Antigone in For Isabel, and that made me thinking about Antigone and Sophocles, and the way that Antigone in some ways is a work about resistance to the state, and it might be, in my mind, one of the earliest works about resistance to the state. Prometheus Bound, perhaps, is a comparable work, but Antigone is so specific and human in the way that it presents characters who are very much pushing against the state norms, and that made me think, like, in some ways, Antigone is this sort of an early protest book. Again, moving closer to sort of the spiritual heart that Tabucchi was going for, the Poems of Lal Ded, Lala, are absolutely extraordinary. I'll link my video to that discussion as well. I couldn't go without mentioning The Stranger by Albert Camus. The Last Good Kiss from James Crumley. Again, a book that is seemingly about looking for a woman who disappeared in the 1960s in California, and yet so much more. Also, like, bonkers and wild and filled with action set pieces that would not appear in any of these other works, but at its core, it's about that same type of truth. And then finally, Sputnik Sweetheart from Haruki Murakami is not my favorite of his works. It might be my single least favorite of all of the works of his that I've read. But at the same time, it's probably the closest that adopts the tone and that questing feel that is at the core of For Isabel. And finally, in terms of the strange, in terms of the questions around the universe and time and an individual's relationship to time or even to reincarnation, Solenoid by Mircea Cartarescu certainly has connections. So let me know if you've read any other works from Antonio Tabucchi. This one was translated by Elizabeth Harris, and I really, really enjoyed it. Hope everybody's doing well. Thanks.